The scent was the first thing that bothered me, an expensive peppery cologne hanging in my parents' kitchen, like a stranger who hadn't quite left, clinging to the rims of polished china and the handle of the back door. My mother stood at the sink with sleeves pushed to the elbow, scrubbing a clean mug until the gold trim flashed under the light, smiling without letting the smile touch her eyes. Outside our neighborhood sounded exactly like Saturdays should, sprinklers hissing across lawns, a child bouncing a basketball, someone starting a mower, and yet the room felt small and airless, as if the walls had learned a secret and were holding their breath. My phone buzzed on the island with a text from Lucas, a heart, and a promise to make it up for missing last night's dinner, the same easy charm that had swept me off my feet. My mother told me I was early, even though it was our usual hour, and she dried her hands too carefully, the towel folded into perfect squares, as if neatness could bless a lie. I lifted the warm mug she'd forgotten to cool and pretended not to notice the cologne threading through the steam. That was the moment a hairline crack opened in the glass of my perfect life, too faint for anyone else to see, too sharp for me to ignore. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, city, state, or country. And if stories of quiet justice help you sleep a little easier at night, tap like and subscribe so more women can find their way to us. My name is Amelia, and until last winter, I thought I understood what a good life required. Show up early, edit clean, keep your word, and when love arrives, welcome it in and make room. I grew up in pews and fellowship halls, stacking chairs after potlucks while my father locked the church, and my mother reminded me that our family's name was a responsibility you ironed, polished, and wore. It wasn't wealth that set us apart, just expectation sermons that spoke of vows and service, a home where the silver came out on holidays and the napkins were linen even for soup. Lucas fit that story the way a final puzzle piece slides home. He was courteous and brilliant, a man who had learned to look people in the eye and make them feel chosen. He proposed on a hotel rooftop after a charity gala, the city glittering behind him, and I said yes, with both hands, laughing when my mother dabbed at her eyes, and my father said grace over champagne as if bubbles were a sacrament. Anyone watching would have named us fortunate. Lucas was the son of a judge and a philanthropist, their family composed in the crisp lines of Christmas cards and board photos, and I was the editor who could take a ragged manuscript and find the heartbeat inside it. Our differences felt like balance rather than distance. His confidence to my steadiness, his taste for big rooms to my love of quiet ones, until the wedding plans began to take on a life of their own. My mother moved through the world like an orchestra conductor, and suddenly every detail marched to her baton lilies instead of wildflowers, a full ensemble instead of a quartet, traditional vows printed on heavy cardstock that took 3 stamps to mail. Classic never embarrasses you, she liked to say, and I tried to be grateful because it came from love, or at least from the version of love she trusted. Lucas charmed her effortlessly, arriving with the right bottle of wine and a compliment pitched in her direction before he kissed my cheek, the 3 of us a tableau my mother would have framed if she could. On the surface, it was a warm, well-lit life, the kind that photographs beautifully, but even photographs carry shadows if you know where to look. The first shadow slipped in as small inconveniences, a rescheduled cake, tasting a canceled Thursday dinner, his text that a meeting had run long and he'd call later. He always did call, voice smooth as a polished step, and I always forgave, telling myself that good men work hard and big cases take time. Then came that Saturday in the kitchen, cologne clinging to porcelain like a thumbprint, my mother folding towels into smaller and smaller squares, as if she could tidy a feeling into silence. I placed the mug in the rack and let it drip beside the others, watching the water bead and run in thin streams. That night, I drove to Lucas's apartment with a container of soup, the kind my father swears will cure most things if you eat it hot and with someone you trust. The doorman greeted me by name and said Lucas was upstairs. The elevator hummed patient as a breath, and I rehearsed a soft joke about stealing him for an hour. In the living room, one wine glass waited on the table, the lipstick ring unfamiliar, a shade deeper than the colors I wear, and the apartment carried the echo of a conversation I'd missed. I called his name twice before reaching for the bedroom doorknob, smiling, already planning to say something about soup and long days and us. The handle turned a fraction, then stopped. The door was locked. The door didn't open that night. I stood in the quiet hallway with a container of soup in my hands, listening to Lucas's muffled voice through the wood. He said he was sick, food poisoning, nothing serious. His tone was steady, but there was a pause after every sentence, as though he was inventing each word on the spot. I offered to take care of him, but he refused, telling me not to risk catching whatever it was. When I told him I loved him, the reply came a beat late, like he had to remember what the right answer should be. I left the container on the counter and walked out, my footsteps heavy in the silent apartment. The next few days passed in a blur of excuses. Lucas canceled our dinner twice, and when I stopped by his office, his secretary told me he had left early. I told myself it was work or stress or the weight of the wedding, but small things were beginning to add up. His texts were shorter, his voice less certain, and the warmth that used to pull me in was turning into distance. At night, I stared at the ceiling and reminded myself that people change under pressure, that maybe I was expecting too much. Yet the memory of that locked door stayed with me, a closed boundary, in a place that had once been mine as much as his. The following week, my mother asked me to run an errand. She said she had left a folder in her car and needed it for a lunch meeting. Her voice was light, but too careful, as though she had rehearsed every word. I drove to their house and found her car in the driveway, unlocked as always. The folder was on the passenger seat just as she described, but another object slipped halfway between the seats caught my attention. It was a black notebook, the cover plain, except for my name written in my mother's careful script. My stomach tightened as I reached for it, my hands trembling even before I turned the first page. The entries began 3 months earlier, right after Lucas had proposed. My mother's handwriting filled the pages, each line deliberate, her voice alive in every sentence. She wrote about her regrets, about how she had chosen my father out of duty and convention, and how she longed for something that still made her feel alive. Then she wrote about Lucas, how he looked at her, how his compliments made her feel seen. Each page grew more detailed, slipping from conversations into touches, then into confessions I had never imagined possible. The words blurred through my tears, but I kept reading, desperate to find some mistake, some reason it wasn't true. One entry described a kiss, another the way he held her afterward, calling her more passionate than anyone he had ever known. The words cut deeper with each line until the final entry froze me in place. It was dated the night before, describing how they would spend one last evening together before the wedding, and how they planned to continue after I became his wife. I dropped the notebook onto the seat and sat there in silence, the world outside unchanged. Children rode their bikes, sprinklers ticked across lawns, and neighbors walked their dogs, while inside me, everything collapsed. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My chest ached with the weight of it, my breath shallow, my hands numb against the leather seat. They had chosen each other, my fiancé and my mother, the two people who should have loved me without question. Every smile, every toast, every moment of joy over the past months now felt like a cruel joke I had never been in on. I cried until I had no tears, left my cheeks streaked with mascara, my heart stripped of its illusions. When the crying stopped, something colder settled in its place. Clarity, hard and unyielding, like ice forming on broken glass. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. Instead, I drove across the city and checked into a hotel under a different name, paying in cash and telling the clerk it was for a surprise anniversary. The lie rolled easily off my tongue, and for the first time, I understood how people could live double lives. In the quiet of the room, I spread the notebook and a pile of evidence across the bed, like puzzle pieces, his credit card charges for wine. I knew my mother favored the scent of cologne in my parents' kitchen, the lipstick on the glass in his apartment, the insistence on traditional vows. Each fragment fit together until the full picture was undeniable. It wasn't an accident or a passing weakness. It was deliberate, and it was meant to continue. Room service delivered pasta I barely tasted, but I forced myself to eat, needing strength for what came next. The old version of myself, the one who believed love could overcome anything, would have confronted them behind closed doors, begging for answers. She would have given second chances, clung to promises, tried to preserve the image of a family worth admiring. But that version of me had been buried in the driver's seat of my mother's car, reading confessions written in her own hand. The woman who rose from that seat was someone new. Someone who understood that private betrayals deserved public truth. I picked up my phone and began to plan. The first call was to my assistant at work, asking her to gather the full list of guests with every email and phone number. I kept my voice light, telling her I wanted everyone to have the right details before tomorrow, and she believed me. The next call was to Nora, my college roommate, who now worked as a photojournalist. She answered excitedly, ready to cheer me on before the wedding, until I asked her to be at the cathedral with her camera and credentials. Her laughter faded into silence, then caution, but she agreed when I told her not to ask questions. The last call was the hardest. I phoned my father, knowing he had just returned from a planning meeting. When he answered, cheerful and unsuspecting, I told him I loved him, that no matter what happened tomorrow, it wasn't his fault. His voice grew worried, but I ended the call before my composure broke. The city outside my hotel window glowed with its ordinary rhythm cars streaming across bridges, lights blinking on in rows of apartments, voices carrying up from the street. But inside, my life had shifted forever. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, staring at my reflection in the glass. My dark hair framed a face that still looked too much like hers, but the eyes staring back were different, harder, steadier. Tomorrow, the people who thought they were coming to witness a celebration would see something else entirely. They would see the truth revealed under the high ceilings of the cathedral, not whispered in corners or hidden in journals. And when I walked into that sanctuary, I would not walk in as a victim. I would walk in as someone ready to choose herself, even if it meant burning down every illusion around me. I didn't sleep much that night in the hotel. The sheets were soft. The room was quiet, but every time I closed my eyes, the images returned my mother's handwriting, filling page after page, Lucas's voice behind a locked door, the warmth of a mug that wasn't hers to use. I lay in the dark with the city's glow pressing against the curtains, my body exhausted, but my mind refusing to rest. By the time dawn painted the sky pale gray, I felt hollowed out, as though tears had carved new lines in me. I didn't recognize myself, and maybe that was the point. Morning came with a barrage of texts from my mother, cheerful notes about flowers and timing about how much she loved me, and how this was going to be the most beautiful day of my life. I read them in silence, each word cutting like paper across skin. It was astonishing how sweet her lies looked when lined up in neat sentences, how she had perfected the role of devoted mother. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and watched it buzz against the wood until it went still. When I finally stood in front of the mirror, I studied the woman staring back. My dark hair hung loose, my skin pale from a sleepless night, but my eyes were different, harder, clearer, unwilling to be fooled again. I wrapped the hotel robe tighter around me, almost like armor, and let the water in the shower wash away what felt like the last traces of the daughter who trusted too easily. I drove slowly through the city toward the cathedral, every block bringing me closer to what waited. The streets were crisp and bright under the fall sun, couples carrying coffee cups, children skipping to Saturday practices. Around me, the world seemed normal, almost careless, while inside my chest, a storm raged with every turn of the wheel. When I pulled into the lot behind the church, cars already lined the street, guests and family bustling inside, unaware of what the day would hold. I sat there a long moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing against the urge to shake. The preparation room hummed with activity when I walked in. My bridesmaids fussed with dresses and makeup, voices rising in nervous laughter. Elise adjusted her veil in the mirror, while Kathleen, my matron of honor, wrapped me in a quick embrace. "You're glowing," she said, her smile wide and sure. I returned it as best I could, though it felt more like a mask. If they noticed the stillness in my voice or the way my hands stayed tight at my sides, they didn't say. The gown lay across a chair, ivory silk that shimmered under the light. My mother had chosen it months ago, brushing aside my suggestions for something simpler. "This will photograph beautifully," she had insisted, her voice full of certainty. I had given in back then, too tired to argue, too eager to keep peace. As Elise and Kathleen fastened the long row of buttons down my back, I felt the weight of the fabric settle over me, heavy and deliberate, like a costume I had been forced to wear. When the veil was pinned in place, I stared at myself in the mirror and whispered silently, "Not for anyone else to hear today. I am not theirs to command." The photographer arrived, filling the room with flashes as he captured smiles and small moments. I posed, lifted my chin, tilted my head, all the gestures of a bride preparing for her vows. He thought he was documenting joy. In truth, he was photographing resolve. Each click of the camera seemed to echo louder than the last, as though even the walls could sense that something unspoken was building. Then my father came. He stood in the doorway, tall and dignified in his tuxedo silver hair, brushed back eyes misting as he took me in. "You look radiant," he said, his voice low, carrying both pride and disbelief. When the others tactfully stepped away, I reached for his hands, the hands that had guided me through childhood, that had steadied me after every fall. I pulled the notebook from my bag and placed it into his palms. Confusion crossed his face at first, but it shifted quickly as he opened the pages. I watched color drain from his skin as his eyes moved across his wife's handwriting. He sat down, heavily trembling, whispering that it couldn't be, that it wasn't possible. I knelt beside him, the silk of my dress pooling around us, and told him to read all of it. His shoulders bent under the weight of betrayal, and for a long time neither of us spoke, just the sound of the pages turning one after another. Finally, he lifted his head. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice broken. I told him only since yesterday that I was sorry for the pain, but not for the truth. He pressed his hand to his eyes, decades of certainty unraveling in the space of minutes. "What do we do now?" he asked, and I answered with a steadiness that surprised even me. "We walk down that aisle. We let everyone see who they really are." He shook his head, torn between fear and duty. 200 people are out there. The scandal, the humiliation. His words faltered, and I interrupted gently. "The humiliation isn't ours, Dad. It belongs to them." He studied me for a long moment, fighting with years of habit that taught him to keep family shame hidden. But then something shifted. His shoulders straightened, his eyes steadied, and I saw a flicker of pride. "You're braver than I ever was," he murmured. I squeezed his hand. "I learned from you." A knock came at the door, the coordinator's voice announcing that it was time. My father rose slowly, still pale, but his arm was firm when he offered it to me. Together, we walked toward the sanctuary doors. Through the glass, I saw the cathedral glowing in the morning light, filled with faces I had known all my life. The music rose, the doors opened, and every eye turned toward me. My mother sat in the front pew, radiant in her emerald dress, a handkerchief pressed to her eyes, the picture of maternal devotion. At the altar, Lucas stood tall in his tuxedo, smiling as though nothing in the world had ever been easier than loving me. I took my father's arm tighter and felt his breath steady beside me. The aisle stretched before us, a path lined with flowers, and expectation leading not just to a man waiting at the altar, but to the reckoning both he and my mother never thought would come. The doors of the cathedral opened wide, and a hush swept over the sanctuary. 200 people rose to their feet, eyes turning toward me, as the first notes of the bridal march filled the vaulted space. My father's arm was steady beneath my hand, though I could feel the tension in his muscles, each step measured against the weight of what he now knew. Cameras flashed, friends and neighbors whispered, and at the far end of the aisle stood Lucas, smiling as if love were the only thing written on his face. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, radiant in her emerald dress, every inch the proud mother of the bride. To those watching it must have looked like perfection. To me, it was a stage prepared for truth. We walked the length of the aisle slowly, the silk of my gown trailing like a river behind me. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to meet my mother's eyes, and instead focused on the man who had once promised me forever. When we reached the altar, my father placed my hand in Lucas's, his face composed, though I saw the strain in his jaw. The pastor smiled, his voice carrying easily through the microphone, as he welcomed the guests and began the ceremony. Lucas squeezed my hand gently, the gesture rehearsed and tender, and I returned the pressure with fingers that no longer trembled. The words of the service rose around us, vows, devotion, promises meant to bind two lives together. My eyes moved over the crowd, familiar faces looking back with warmth and expectation. Neighbors who had known me since childhood, colleagues from the publishing house, members of my father's congregation, who believed they were about to witness a sacred covenant. And in the front pew, my mother leaned forward with theatrical emotion, her handkerchief pressed to her eyes. She had no idea how quickly that image would crumble. Lucas the pastor asked, "Do you take Amelia to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, forsaking all others, until death do you part?" "I do," Lucas said, clearly, his voice strong, his eyes locked on mine with convincing devotion. The lie was so smooth it almost took my breath away. Then the pastor turned to me. "Amelia, do you take Lucas to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, forsaking all others, until death do you part?" The sanctuary was silent, the air heavy with expectation. I looked at Lucas, then at my father seated behind him, his eyes glistening, but resolute. I glanced at my mother, her lips parted in a small, trembling smile, as if she were savoring her victory. The sight of her was the final spark. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and clear enough to carry through the cathedral, "I have something to say first." The pastor blinked in confusion. Murmurs rippled through the congregation, heads turning as people shifted in their seats. Lucas's hand tightened around mine, his smile faltering. "Amelia," he whispered low and urgent. "What are you doing?" I pulled my hand free and stepped closer to the microphone. Before I make the most important promise of my life, I should be honest with the people gathered here. You all deserve to know the truth. The whispers grew louder. My mother froze the handkerchief slipping from her grasp. In the back, I caught sight of Nora, her camera steady recording every word as we had planned. Yesterday, I said, my gaze sweeping across the congregation, I discovered that Lucas, the man standing beside me, and my mother, the woman in the front pew, have been having an affair. Gasps echoed through the sanctuary, sharp as breaking glass. Someone dropped a program. Chairs scraped as people shifted in disbelief. Judge Grant, Lucas's father, shot to his feet, his face ashen as he stared at his son. I held up the notebook, the one I had found in my mother's car, its pages filled with her confessions. I found her journal. Every detail of their relationship is written here. How it began after my engagement, where they met, what they said to each other, even their plans to continue after this wedding. My mother rose halfway from her seat, her face flushed with panic. "Amelia! Stop this!" she cried, her voice sharp, desperate. "Sit down, Vivian," my father said firmly, his voice carrying with the authority of a man who had led a congregation for 30 years. She sank back into her pew, as though struck, her eyes wide with humiliation. Lucas shook his head wildly, his voice breaking as he tried to speak. "Everyone, please, there's some mistake. This isn't... Is it a mistake that you spent last night at my parents' house while my father was away?" I asked, my voice rising above the murmurs. "Is it a mistake that you used our joint credit card to buy wine my mother described loving in her journal?" Judge Grant turned to his son, his voice trembling with rage. "Lucas, tell me this isn't true." But Lucas had no defense. He looked from me to his father, to the stunned guests, his lips moving, but no words forming. The silence that followed was damning. Tears streamed down my mother's face, now not the gentle tears of pride, but harsh, ugly sobs. "Amelia, please," she choked. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice like glass cutting through the air. "You chose your own desire over your daughter's happiness. You decided I was expendable if it meant feeling wanted again." Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking while the people around her stared in horror. Friends she had tried so hard to impress turned away, unable to mask their disgust. I turned back to the congregation, drawing a deep breath. This isn't about revenge. It's about truth. It's about refusing to build a life on lies. Today, instead of binding myself to a man who deceived me and a mother who betrayed me, I choose myself. Then I stepped away from the altar, gathering the train of my gown in my hands as I began to walk down the aisle. The whispers swelled into a storm, but I kept my head high, each step measured and certain. As I passed the front row, I paused beside my father. He looked at me with eyes brimming with pride and sorrow. "I'm sorry you had to learn this way," I whispered, "but I'm not sorry, you know." He nodded, tears falling freely. "You did the right thing," he said softly. I kissed his forehead, then turned and walked the rest of the aisle alone. Behind me, chaos erupted, Lucas pleading with his father, my mother weeping, guests speaking in sharp whispers, the pastor frozen in disbelief. But I didn't look back. The cathedral doors opened to the cool air outside. I stepped through them into the light, my dress sweeping across the stone steps, my heart beating with a steady rhythm that no longer belonged to anyone but me. The sounds of confusion and betrayal faded behind me, replaced by the quiet certainty of freedom. In that moment, I knew everything had changed. But the reckoning was only beginning, and the ripples of what I had done inside those walls would reach further than even I could imagine. The October air outside the cathedral was crisp, sharp enough to clear the fog from my mind as I stepped into the parking lot. My gown brushed across the stone steps, the long train catching the sunlight as I paused to breathe. Behind the heavy doors, voices still rose in confusion, anger, and disbelief. But I kept my eyes forward. The sound of a single camera shutter clicked from a distance, Nora doing what I had asked. My phone vibrated in my clutch messages already pouring in, but I ignored them all until I saw her name. "Holy hell, Amelia," Nora said when I answered. Her voice was hushed, but electric. I got everything, every word, every reaction. This footage is going to spread like wildfire. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying my breath. "Good," I said quietly. "Make sure it's everywhere by tonight." There was silence on the line before she spoke again. "Are you okay?" I thought about it standing there in my wedding dress, while my mother's sobs echoed behind the church doors. "I'm perfect," I replied, and for the first time in months, I meant it. By the time I drove away, the video had already started making its way through private group chats and social feeds. Within hours, it was on local news websites, the headline brutal in its simplicity: "Bride exposes fiancé and mother at the altar." The footage showed everything: my calm voice, Lucas's stammering denials, my mother's collapse, my father's command to sit her down. By nightfall, the story had moved beyond our community. Strangers online were debating every frame, dissecting every expression, some calling it justice, others heartbreak, but none of it touched me. The truth was out, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, I woke in my hotel to a courier knocking at the door. In his hands was a handwritten letter, thick cream paper folded neatly inside an envelope. It was from Margaret Grant Lucas's mother. Her words were careful, almost elegant, but they carried something real. She wrote that she was horrified by her son's betrayal, that she admired my courage, and that she wished me a future free of people who did not deserve me. I sat by the window, reading those lines over and over, surprised at the comfort they brought. For years, I had envied the Grant family's polish, but in that moment, I realized dignity wasn't about appearances. It was about truth. My father's phone rang constantly in the days that followed. Members of the congregation called to offer support. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and quiet prayers, and friends dropped notes of encouragement at the front door. People weren't whispering about us in pity, they were rallying, standing with him in a way I never expected. For my mother, it was the opposite. Within days, she was asked to step down from every charity board she chaired. Invitations stopped coming, calls went unanswered, and the same women she had tried so hard to impress now avoided her gaze at the grocery store. The emerald dress she had chosen so carefully was already infamous, a symbol of arrogance and shame. She tried to reach me. Calls came at all hours, voicemail after voicemail, but I let everyone go unanswered. There was nothing she could say to undo what she had done. My father spoke to her once, his voice flat, as he told her he had filed for divorce. I watched him pack books into boxes in his study, his movement slow but sure. "You don't have to resign," I told him for the 10th time. He shook his head, taping another box closed. "How can I stand in a pulpit and preach about marriage when my own wife made a mockery of it? The congregation deserves better." His shoulders seemed heavier, his face lined, but there was also a strange peace there, as though truth, however painful, had freed him. Through the window, I saw my mother loading her suitcases into the car, moving into her sister's house in Baltimore. She didn't look up at the window, didn't try to catch my eye. Whatever bond had existed between us had been severed, replaced by silence and distance. I stood beside my father in the study, the scent of old books and dust rising from the boxes, and felt both grief and relief in the same breath. That afternoon, a knock sounded at the front door. My father opened it to reveal Judge Grant standing on the porch, his face tired, his usually polished appearance rumpled. He stepped into the study, his hands clasped in front of him, and spoke with a humility I had never seen. "I came to apologize," he said, "for my son, for what he's done, and for how it has hurt your family." I studied him, waiting for the defensiveness I half expected, but there was none. Only remorse. "You're not responsible for his choices," I said. He shook his head. "I raised him to believe charm could erase consequences that the world would always bend for him. I created a man who thought he was entitled to anything he wanted. That's on me." His words carried a bitterness that surprised me. I looked at him, then at my father beside me. "You raised a son," I answered quietly. "He chose to be a man without honor. That's not yours to carry." He nodded slowly, his eyes heavy. "Victoria and I are getting counseling. We're trying to understand where we went wrong, how we failed him so completely." His voice cracked on the word failed, and I felt a flicker of something close to pity. "Don't let his choices define your marriage," I said. "Some people are broken inside. It doesn't mean the ones who love them are." Judge Grant looked at me for a long time, his expression softening. "You're remarkable," he said. "Most people would be destroyed by what you've endured, but you're standing here offering wisdom to a man who doesn't deserve it." He turned to my father, then his shoulders stooped. "I wish I could undo what has been done, but I can't. All I can do is say I'm sorry." After he left, my father and I stood in silence, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, turning the dust in the study into flecks of gold. "Any regrets?" I asked him quietly. He closed the final box and shook his head. "No, not about leaving, not about divorcing. Only gratitude that I raised a daughter who chose dignity over silence." His words settled into me like a balm. The days ahead would not be easy. My family was fractured, my name carried on the tongues of strangers, and the pieces of my life lay scattered. But I had faced betrayal without bowing to it, and in the quiet of that study, standing beside the man who had taught me to value truth, I realized I was no longer afraid of what came next. The reckoning inside the cathedral had been only the beginning. The ripples of that moment were still spreading, touching lives and reshaping futures, and I could already feel the next wave rising on the horizon. The weeks that followed were a blur of headlines and whispers, my name traveling farther than I ever imagined. Nora's footage spread quickly, first through local circles, then across the country, until strangers I would never meet were dissecting the moment I chose myself at the altar. At first, the attention was overwhelming, the weight of strangers' opinions pressing in on my private grief. But gradually, I saw something else begin to emerge, letters from women I didn't know, messages from men and women alike who had survived their own betrayals. They weren't reaching out with pity, but with gratitude, thanking me for doing publicly what they hadn't found the courage to do in private. Meanwhile, Lucas disappeared from view. Judge Grant's statement that his son was taking an indefinite leave was widely read as a career death sentence. The polished attorney who once carried himself with an air of inevitability was suddenly a man no law firm wanted to touch. Friends who once filled his weekends with dinners and outings no longer returned his calls. I didn't need to follow his every move to know that his world had collapsed. That was the nature of truth. It didn't just sting, it stripped everything bare. My mother's downfall was quieter, but in its own way, more brutal. Vivian had spent years curating an image of elegance and influence, balancing church committees with charity galas. Now the very women she once tried to impress avoided her at luncheons, lowering their eyes in the grocery store. She was asked to step away from every board. She served, invitations dwindled, and the emerald dress she had once worn with pride became a symbol whispered about in disapproval. She called often in those first weeks, leaving messages filled with apologies and pleas, her voice growing smaller each time. I never returned a single call. The silence was deliberate. My father carried his burden differently. When his resignation became public, the congregation's response was swift, an outpouring of support for him, letters and phone calls affirming their respect. Yet I knew it cost him dearly to step down from the pulpit he had loved for decades. The study, once filled with sermon notes, now stood empty, the books packed away, the shelves bare. But in his eyes, I also saw relief. He had chosen integrity, and though it left him with an uncertain future, it lifted the shadow of living beside a woman who had betrayed him so profoundly. In the middle of this upheaval, I started over in quiet ways. I found an apartment in Alexandria, small, but filled with light, and took long walks in the mornings through streets where no one recognized me. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to meet anyone's expectations. I went to work. I came home. I read in silence, and I let the pieces of myself settle into something steady again. The freedom was fragile but real, and each day I held on to it more firmly. One evening, as the light faded across the city, I sat at my kitchen table when a knock came at the door. Standing there was Margaret Grant, her face drawn but graceful, her hands clasped tightly around a small box. "I hope this isn't unwelcome," she said softly. I stepped aside and let her in. She placed the box on the table and opened it to reveal a delicate bracelet, gold, with a single sapphire. "It belonged to my grandmother," she explained. "I can't undo what my son has done, but I can tell you that you deserved better. And I wanted you to have something that carries dignity, not deceit." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. I reached across the table and closed her hand around mine. "Thank you," I said. The weight of that moment stayed with me long after she left, the quiet acknowledgement from a woman who had lost just as much in a different way. We were bound by grief, but also by a recognition of what it meant to love someone who had chosen dishonor. Despite everything, life did not grind to a halt. Each week brought something new, another message of support, another reminder of the ripple my choice had created. At first, I resisted reading the articles and watching the interviews, but eventually I allowed myself to see how the story had spread. They called me courageous, reckless, inspiring, foolish. It didn't matter. What mattered was that people were talking about the cost of silence, about the weight of betrayal, about the courage it took to choose dignity, even when it meant standing alone. My mother, I heard, had settled into her sister's home, living in the margins of the life she once commanded. Occasionally, word reached me through distant relatives that she was still trying to explain herself, still trying to gather sympathy. But sympathy was scarce when the truth had been laid bare so publicly. Each time I heard her name, I felt only the certainty that I had done what needed to be done. Lucas never reached out directly. His attorney contacted mine, once suggesting he wanted to make amends, but I declined. There was nothing left between us but ashes, and I had no desire to sift through them. His absence was its own answer, his silence, its own confession. I began to sense that the worst of the storm had passed. The story that had consumed headlines was slowly being replaced by newer scandals, fresher drama. But for me, the echoes remained. Strangers still stopped me in quiet places, a woman in the bookstore, placing a hand on mine, a man at the coffee shop, nodding in silent respect. Each time I understood more deeply that my story had ceased to be only mine. It had become something larger, a reminder to others that silence does not protect, and that truth, even when painful, sets you free. One morning, as I trimmed fresh flowers for a vase, I thought about the choices still ahead. My life was no longer tethered to Lucas, no longer bound to my mother's expectations. The road forward was mine to shape. The past had broken me, but it had also revealed a strength I didn't know I carried. And yet, even as peace began to settle around me, I knew the consequences were not finished. There were still deeper reckonings ahead, decisions to face, conversations to have, and scars that would not vanish overnight. The moment in the cathedral had been a breaking point, but it was also the beginning of something far larger. And as the days unfolded, I could feel that the next wave of consequences was already moving toward me, ready to test whether my resolve would hold. Winter settled in before the full weight of what I had done began to show. The story that had once consumed headlines had faded from the news cycle, but its consequences still unfolded quietly in the corners of my life. Each week seemed to bring a new ripple. My father moved to Vermont, taking an interim post at a small church where the congregation welcomed him not for his history, but for his honesty. His voice over the phone carried a peace I hadn't heard in years. He had lost nearly everything: his marriage, his pulpit, the woman he once believed he knew, but he sounded lighter, as if truth had finally released him from chains he never realized were there. Lucas, I learned, had left Washington. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that he had tried to start over in another city, but his name followed him wherever he went. Courtrooms and firms were not eager to associate with a man whose betrayal had been broadcast for all to see. He had once thrived on power and reputation, but without those, he was simply a man whose choices had left him with nothing solid to stand on. His silence toward me remained unbroken, and I never sought to change that. My mother's fall was even harsher. Vivian, who once planned luncheons and hosted fundraisers with practiced grace, was now spoken of in whispers. She lingered in Baltimore with her sister, her days filled with the dull routine of errands instead of the grand stages she had once sought. Friends she used to impress now avoided her gaze in public places. It was not just that she had betrayed her family. It was that she had been caught in the very act of pretending to be its shining example. That hypocrisy clung to her like a shadow she could not shake. For me, the months became a time of slow rebuilding. I poured myself into work, taking an offer from a larger publishing house in New York, where the pace was demanding but freeing. The city's vastness gave me anonymity. I could walk down the street and be no one in particular, not the woman from the video, not the daughter who exposed her mother, just Amelia with a stack of manuscripts under her arm. In that space, I began to breathe again. Yet reminders of what had happened still reached me. Strangers sent flowers to my office sometimes with simple notes of encouragement, sometimes with longer letters describing their own stories of betrayal. One afternoon, I came home to find a bouquet of wildflowers, the kind I had once wanted for my wedding, waiting outside my door. The card read only for choosing truth. From someone who understands. I never discovered who sent it, but the gesture carried me through that week. The church where I had once imagined being married was still a subject of conversation in our community. People would speak of the day in hushed tones, their voices carrying both shock and admiration. My father told me once that parishioners often stopped him to say I had shown them something they had never seen from the pulpit, the cost of honesty and the dignity it brings. I didn't know how to answer when he told me that, except to nod and let his words rest in the quiet between us. The true reckoning, though, was watching my mother's world unravel piece by piece. A woman who had built her identity on appearances now had to live without the social circles that had once validated her. She sent letters, some long, some brief each, filled with apologies and explanations. I kept them all in a drawer, but never opened them. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be born from carefully chosen words on paper. It would require something she had not yet shown an ability to accept the full weight of her choices without trying to soften them. Until then, the silence remained. It struck me often how justice did not need to roar to be effective. It could arrive quietly in the empty seat at a luncheon, in the job offer rescinded after a background search, in the stillness of a home stripped of its laughter. I hadn't screamed, I hadn't fought in private halls, I had simply spoken the truth where all could hear it. And that truth had done the work for me, unraveling the fabric of lies, until those who had woven them were left with nothing but their own threads in hand. By spring, my life in New York had found a rhythm. I rented a small garden apartment in Alexandria before moving permanently north, a space with a patch of green where I planted flowers and watched them bloom. On quiet mornings, I would sit outside with a cup of coffee, the air fresh with possibility, and think about how far I had come. It wasn't the life I had once imagined, but it was mine, built on a foundation of honesty rather than illusion. And yet I knew this was not the end. The story had given me freedom, but it had also given me a voice. Invitations began to arrive, not for weddings or galas, but for conferences and gatherings where people wanted me to speak about truth and resilience. At first, I hesitated, unsure if my story was worth repeating beyond the people who had witnessed it. But as the messages from strangers continued, I began to understand that the moment at the altar had become larger than me. It was a reminder that even the deepest betrayals could be met with courage. The day I accepted the first invitation, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. I was no longer defined by what Lucas and my mother had done. I was defined by what I chose to do in the face of it. And as I stood at my kitchen table with the letter of invitation in my hand, I realized that the reckoning was complete for them, but for me, it was only the beginning of something new. The final chapter of this story was waiting just ahead, not in the pain of betrayal, but in the strength I had claimed from it. And as I looked toward that next step, I knew the most important lesson was yet to be spoken. The first spring in New York felt like a promise. Cherry blossoms lined the streets outside my apartment, scattering petals across sidewalks like confetti. And each morning, I walked to work beneath branches heavy with pale pink. Life was no longer about what I had lost. It was about what I was quietly building step by step. My father called every Sunday from Vermont, his voice calmer now, no longer carrying the tension of holding a congregation together. He told me about the small church where people came not for appearances, but for faith. Sometimes I heard birdsong through his window while he spoke, and I knew he had found peace in a way he never could have in Washington. The past had scarred him, yes, but it had also freed him. Lucas remained a ghost, drifting into silence with a reputation ruined beyond repair. There were no more statements, no more attempts to reach me, and I was glad. I had no need for explanations or apologies. The truth had spoken loudly enough. My mother faded into her own shadow. Vivian still sent letters through relatives' apologies written in graceful script, but I left them unopened. Forgiveness could not be forced by ink on paper. It would take more than words to rebuild trust, and perhaps that day would never come. What surprised me most was how my story found others, Invitations arrived, asking me to speak at conferences not as a victim, but as a woman who had chosen dignity when silence would have been easier. I remember standing at a podium in a crowded ballroom, the lights warm on my face, telling strangers how I once walked away from a future everyone thought was perfect. Heads nodded in understanding, eyes glistened in sympathy, and I realized my voice could help others find their own. In those moments, I understood that justice had already been served. Not by punishing Lucas or isolating Vivian, but by refusing to let their betrayal define me. Justice was in the quiet mornings in my garden, in the pages I edited with a clear mind, in the laughter I began to share with new friends. It was in reclaiming my life without apology. One evening, I lit a single candle and sat by the window while the city hummed outside. I thought of the woman I had been the day before the wedding, frightened, heartbroken, unsure of how to face what I had discovered. And then I thought of the woman who had stood in that cathedral, who had spoken the truth without trembling, who had walked out with her head high. Those two selves had merged into one. Stronger, clearer, unwilling to compromise dignity for comfort ever again. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in destruction, but in liberation. Sometimes the most powerful gift we can give ourselves is to stop carrying the weight of other people's betrayals. And sometimes the real happily ever after is simply choosing to live in truth. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.